For many of us, a fictional murder mystery provides not only good entertainment, but also a satisfying conclusion, something we see less often in real life. Loose ends are neatly tied, and every clue is logical and has its place in a path that leads straight to the door of the killer. Unfortunately, for real-life detectives, that isn't always the case. Even cases that come with clues don't always lead to a tidy, happy ending, and are harder to decipher than their fictional counterparts would let on. Here in this video, we're going to be looking at such incidents, so here are 4 unsolved cases with unsettling clues. Henry McCabe. 32-year-old Henry McCabe worked as an auditor in Minnesota and was described as an outgoing and open man. He had 2 children whom he adored and a happy marriage, and the only thing that seemed to be a bit off in his life were reports that some recent bad reviews at work had taken place. On Labour Day, September the 7th, 2015, Henry spent the night out with friends, drinking and having fun at a club. Henry's friend William Kennedy claimed he dropped Henry off at a gas station convenience store, Super America, that night near his home after they'd finished partying, and that he'd taken Henry's keys from him, while another friend took his wallet to stop him buying more drinks. Reportedly, Henry was in a bad state from drinking too much alcohol. He was last seen alive around 2 AM. However, when police found that neither Kennedy nor his car were on CCTV that night, they questioned his story about what happened on September the 7th. Kennedy then clarified that he'd dropped Henry off at a different gas station, a holiday gas station, and this was verified by surveillance footage. That night at around 2:23 AM, Henry's wife, who was in California at the time, received an unsettling phone call from her husband. His garbled message, consisting of screams, moans and gurgling sounds heard over the line, is chilling to say the least. Henry reportedly says he's been shot, and after a short silence, a voice yells, "Stop it." One news outlet reported that Henry also left a voicemail on his brother's phone, but it is unknown what the voicemail contains. Henry had been dropped off just 20 minutes before the call, and it is not understood exactly what happened in that period of time that led to the disturbing voicemail. His mobile phone was disconnected shortly after the call. 2 months later, on November the 2nd, a kayaker uncovered the 32-year-old's body in Rush Lake at around 4:30 PM. There were no cuts to his body, nor any wounds of any kind, including bullet wounds, so why did Henry claim he had been shot? He was found 6 miles from the gas station where he was dropped off, and police said his body had been there in the water for a long time. The Ramsey County autopsy report claimed that Henry had likely died from drowning in fresh waters, and authorities say there's nothing suspicious about the death. But how does this account for the disturbing voicemail? There are certainly more questions than answers in the case of Henry McCabe, and while many believe he simply drowned by accident, no theory seems to answer the question of the graphic voicemail. Alistair Wilson. 30-year-old Alistair Wilson resided in Nairn in northeast Scotland in 2004. He'd been married to his wife Veronica for 6 years, and they had 2 young children together. Currently working as a banker, Alistair was set to chase after greener pastures by heading to a new job in 2 weeks' time. Tragically, however, Alistair never got to realise his new goals. On November the 28th, 2004, Alistair and his family were catching up with friends in their home and looking after another friend's 18-month-old child when the doorbell went. Thinking it was their friend arriving early to pick up their baby, Veronica headed down the stairs to answer the door, only to be greeted by a stranger. The only words to leave his lips were Alistair Wilson. Unalarmed, Veronica returned upstairs to fetch her husband, assuming since the man knew his name, that it was something to do with work. She took over the duties of reading bedtime stories with the kids, while Alistair headed downstairs. Reportedly, the exchange that took place next between Alistair and the stranger went on for several minutes, but it is not known publicly what was said. When Alistair returned to his wife, he seemed perplexed, but not fearful, she noted. Alistair clutched a bright blue envelope in his hand, with the name Paul written on the front. The envelope was empty inside. Puzzled, the couple discussed what to do next. As Alistair didn't appear shaken and just seemed genuinely confused, Veronica let him return downstairs to look for the man. The stranger was still on their doorstep. Several gunshots rang out, and Veronica, panicking, ran to her husband downstairs, attempting to stop the blood gushing from his wounds as she screamed at neighbours for help. She saw the gunman leaving, but stayed to try and save her husband. Alistair was shot twice in the head and once in the body, and died an hour later in hospital. Curiously, the blue envelope he'd been holding earlier had now disappeared. 10 days after the shooting, a maintenance worker found an antique gun in a drain not far from the home, which authorities later found to be the murder weapon. However, there was no DNA of the killer on the gun. Veronica remembers the appearance of the murderer very well. He is described as white, stocky, around 5'6" to 5'10", and aged about 35 to 40 years old. He wore a dark baseball cap pulled down over his face, a dark blue blouson jacket and dark jeans. His face was clean shaven. Police have created a sketch of what the man looks like, with the help of a witness who saw the man on a bus. However, it has never been released to the public for reasons unknown. A lot of mystery shrouds the murder of Alistair Wilson, later dubbed the doorstep murder. No one is quite sure on what the answer is to the blue envelope, or why Alistair was targeted. One of the more popular theories is that the unidentified assailant was a hired hitman, some even speculating that Veronica hired him. However, she is not considered a suspect. Some suggest Alistair had borrowed money from the criminal underworld and was involved with organised crime, while many think it's simply a case of mistaken identity and that the wrong Alistair Wilson was killed. However, no one has a real answer about the envelope. Online sleuths speculate that Alistair was supposed to put something in the envelope, and it's theorised he was shot because he didn't. But this doesn't account for why the name Paul was written on the front, or what exactly the envelope was for. It's likely the killer took back the envelope as it may have had his DNA on it. The murder of Alistair Wilson is still being investigated, and his case remains open and unsolved. His wife still resides in the same house to this day, and sadly, her children grew up without their father. Mary Shotwell Little. Born January 14th, 1940, Mary Shotwell Little was a newlywed and just 25 years old at the time of her disappearance from Atlanta, Georgia in October of 1965. Working as a secretary at C&S Bank, Mary had married just 6 weeks prior to the date she went missing, to Roy Little, a bank examiner who was training to be an auditor. Roy was out of town on October 14th on a work-related trip, and Mary was planning a party to welcome him back home. Mary stopped off for groceries after she finished work, and then met one of her co-workers for dinner in the Lenox Square shopping centre in the Buckhead neighbourhood of Atlanta. She was reportedly in good spirits, and spoke happily of married life. She left her colleague and headed back to her car around 8 PM, telling them that she'd see them tomorrow. This was the last time Mary was positively seen. When she didn't show up for work the next day or call in sick, Mary's boss and colleagues grew concerned. Her boss spoke to the co-worker she'd dined with, who said her metallic pearl grey 1965 Mercury Comet with Georgia license plate number 2829 was in the parking lot near to where they'd eaten. However, when Mary's boss phoned the shopping centre security to ask them to look for the car, they couldn't find it. Yet when he turned up, Mary's boss located it right away, where it was described as being by the colleague. There were many strange clues around Mary's vehicle. Firstly, it had a coating of red dust on its exterior, suggesting that someone had driven it down a dirt road. Secondly was its unusual contents. The 4 bags of groceries from the previous evening were still there, but so were several pieces of Mary's clothing. Her slip, underwear and girdle were all neatly folded and placed on the console between the 2 front seats, while her bra and stocking were found on the floor, the latter of which had been cut, likely with a knife. There was blood speckled on the clothing, and more of it smeared in the car, on the steering wheel, the driver's door near the handle, the inside of the window on the passenger side, and the front seats. Investigators said the amount of blood was very little and comparable to that of a nosebleed. There were also bloody fingerprints on the steering wheel. Although testing on blood was limited in 1965, what was found in the car did match the blood type of Mary's, and so it was presumed to be hers. However, the case only gets stranger from here. Mary's bank card was used twice in North Carolina. On October the 15th, the card was used in Charlotte, Mary's hometown, and once in Raleigh. The attendants working at the time both recalled a woman with a small head injury and bloodstains on her head and legs. They said she was with either one or two middle-aged men, sources differ, who seemed to be commanding her. She seemed to hide her face from the attendants and didn't ask for help. More curiously yet is the fact that the time elapsed between credit card usage was 12 hours, but the distance between the two cities was only 2 to 3 hours. It was also found that the license plate on Mary's car was now a Charlotte, North Carolina plate, despite Mary's car being legal and with all the correct tags. The Charlotte plates had come from a recently stolen car, and police suspect that this was why security couldn't spot Mary's car previously. It's also speculated that the car was hidden on the 14th and returned to its parking spot on the 15th. A $20,000 ransom demand was given to Roy, and an FBI agent went in his place to make the drop. He was supposed to find further instructions attached to a sign at the location. However, he found an empty piece of paper on the sign instead. Nothing further came of this ransom demand, which is considered to likely be a cruel hoax by pranksters. Theories on the case of Mary Shotwell Little are very broad. Her husband Roy was investigated and appeared to be less than heartbroken at the disappearance of his new wife. Many of Mary's former roommates didn't like her choice of husband and boycotted their wedding as a result. Seemingly unfazed by the situation, Roy declined to take a lie detector test on several occasions, but police eventually ruled him out as they saw no motive for him to murder Mary, and he had a solid alibi. To cast more weirdness on the entire case, Mary's friends and colleagues came forward to tell of how she began to receive odd phone calls shortly before disappearing. Mary told the person on the other end of the line that she was married and couldn't visit them anymore, but that they could visit her. Nobody knows the identity of this person. She also received flowers from a secret admirer, and although police tracked down which store they came from, they could not ID the buyer. Friends made further startling revelations when they admitted that she spoke of fearing being home alone and driving unaccompanied, just before her disappearance. She never told them why or what she feared, but several days before she went missing, Mary insinuated to colleagues that she had something important to tell them, but again, she never did. Many speculate that a scandal at her work involving sexual harassment and a prostitution ring operating on bank property had something to do with Mary's disappearance. Perhaps she uncovered some dangerous information, or was involved in some way. Supposedly the FBI had become involved in the scandal, but no further details were released to the public, it seems. Days after Mary vanished, a woman came forward to report being accosted by a man in the same parking lot, and it's theorised that this could be the same man who hurt Mary. Some police who investigated the case originally suspect that there was no murder or abduction at all, and that Mary had staged the scene so that she could run away and start over without facing the stigmatism of divorce. The last twist in the case of Mary Shotwell Little is that in May of 1967, a woman who was working in the same office that Mary had been working in was murdered. Diane Shields was last seen leaving work in her car, and at 2:30 a.m, the car was found on Sylvan Road, Atlanta. Her body was inside the trunk. She still wore her engagement ring and was fully clothed. She'd been suffocated via a scarf being shoved down her throat. In an eerie coincidence, Diane had shared roommates with Mary at different times of their lives, and had also told a friend that she was undercover for police to solve the disappearance of Mary. Although this last fact hasn't been fully verified, it certainly makes for a creepy addition to the tale. Mary Shotwell Little's case file later went missing, and her disappearance remains unsolved to this day. She has not been seen or heard from since she went missing. Her father died in 1979, but her mother continues to look for answers. Tracie Nielsen. Found stabbed to death in her apartment by her husband, Jeff, Tracie Nielsen should have been celebrating her 21st birthday when she was murdered on January the 5th, 1981. While Jeff had been out buying his wife a birthday gift, Tracie remained at home, her friends' birthday wishes going unanswered due to what they assumed was her busy life. Nobody in Tracie's life expected the reason that she wasn't answering the phone to be that she had been murdered. She'd been slashed numerous times above the waist, and her throat had been slit. Her husband is not a suspect. There was no struggle in the apartment, nor any signs of forced entry, and while information on Tracie's case is few and far between, there are some odd clues. Tracie's tortoise-coloured keyring with her name on it was taken from her home, and it's suspected that the killer has hung onto it as a trophy. In recent years, a sketch of what the keyring looks like, a 1" by 4" rectangle, has been released, in the hopes of someone coming forward with answers. Even stranger yet was the Southwestern Bell cable logbook found in Jeff and Tracie's home. The day of the murder, there was a page in the book that claimed work on Tracie's cable had been scheduled for before noon that day at 11:51 AM. There were initials and several numbers on the end of the paper, but detectives haven't worked out their significance as of yet. Police asked around and discovered that actually no cable repair company was scheduled to be there that day, and while the book was tracked to Southwestern Bell, they couldn't narrow this down to a single employee, and so who the book belongs to remains unknown. It's theorised that the murderer used this book to gain access to Tracie's home without raising any alarms. Since the murder, 1,600 leads have been traced by authorities, who also found a single unidentified fingerprint in the apartment. There are also 2 witness accounts, describing similar but slightly different looking men in the area at the time, who may have been the murderer. One statement claims the man was in his late 20s, 5'9", 155 pounds, with curly brown hair, and a day's beard growth, while the other statement claims the man was in his early 30s, 5'10", between 150 and 170 pounds, with short black hair in a military style and short sideburns. However, no successful leads seem to have come from this, and no sketches were released to the public. The case of Tracie Nielsen remains unsolved almost 4 decades later. So, that's 4 unsolved cases with unsettling clues. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.